On August 21st, 1955, the Taylor family was visiting their friends at a farmhouse in Kentucky when they had a close encounter of the weird kind. It all started when Billy Taylor went to go get some water from the well, when all of a sudden he saw a rainbow-colored dish-shaped UFO land less than a mile away. Billy ran back and told his family, but they all laughed at Billy and they told him that his eyes must have been playing tricks on him. But not too long after Billy's sighting, the family's dog started to go crazy, and it was barking at the door. So the men of the family grabbed their rifles and went outside to go see what was scaring their dog. And just right after they opened the door, they came face to face with a glowing entity that was about 3 feet tall, had a huge head, floppy ears, and glowing eyes. And if that wasn't scary enough, they also said that this creature was floating. They also noticed that it was wearing a silvery, metallic outfit. The men were frozen in fear. They just couldn't believe their eyes. Then this creature started to charge at the men. The men went into panic mode and started to shoot at this creature. Now the gunfire did scare this alien, and it ran or floated back into the woods. The men ran back into the house and tried to make sense of what just happened. A couple of minutes later, this alien, or whatever it was looking through the window, and the whole family started to scream their heads off. So the men loaded up their rifles again and started to shoot like maniacs. After the smoke cleared, they were sure that whatever this was dead. So they went outside to see if they could find a body, but there was no trace of this creature anywhere. So on the way back to the house, they saw another one, and this one was on the porch. The men again started to fire like crazy. They now believed that these beings were bulletproof, as they watched the bullets just bounce right off their skin. But nevertheless, the gunfire scared it, and it went back into the woods. So the men went back inside the farmhouse and started to fortify their house. They hoped and prayed that this was all over. But this was just the beginning. Later that night, the creature started to appear again at the windows, and the Taylors believed that there had to have been at least more than 3 of them. And for 3 hours, the men were running all around the house, shooting like crazy, doing whatever they could to scare these creatures away and protect their family. Now once things died down, the Taylors made a run for it. They ran as fast as they could to their vehicle and floored it out of there. They went straight to the police station. Sheriff Russell was the first to hear about the Taylors' out-of-this-world encounter, and the first thing he did was a sobriety check. Once the sheriff realized that these people were sober, he tried to comprehend and make sense of what happened. After a couple hours passed by, he realized that this was not a prank. He knew that the Taylors experienced something terrifying, as he could see the fear in their eyes. Now when the police went to go investigate, they couldn't find no signs of these creatures, but they did notice that the house was filled with bullet holes. Now during that night, there were tons of strange objects being reported in the sky. Even a state highway trooper saw one of these objects, making a lot of people believe that the Taylors might just be telling the truth. Brazil, September 15th, 1977. A bus driver named Antonio spotted a huge, hat-shaped UFO in a field near his house. Antonio estimated that this craft had to have been at least 250 feet long and a couple hundred feet high. Antonio, very curious, started to approach this craft. But as he was getting closer, he started to get afraid. Then he realized that this couldn't have been man-made. So Antonio turned around and started to run. Then Antonio noticed a very bright blue light coming from behind him, and this light paralyzed him. As Antonio was frozen stiff, he started to hear some noises behind him. Then he came face to face with some strange-looking robots. These robots were about 4 feet tall and had very small antennas on top of their heads. These robots also had very odd elephant-like arms. The frozen Antonio watched in fear as they started to inspect him. After the quick inspection, the robots took Antonio to the huge, hat-shaped craft. Antonio found himself in a very large, very oddly colored circular room. Antonio noticed that he was surrounded by robots. The first thing these robots did to him was take some of his blood. Then they escorted him throughout this massive UFO. Antonio couldn't believe what he was looking at. Now he knew this craft was big, but he couldn't grasp how big it actually was. Antonio saw a huge city within this UFO, and there were robots everywhere. They were building all sorts of stuff. Now once the robots were done doing whatever they were doing to him, they dropped him off in the middle of the city. Antonio was completely naked, and he ran straight to the police station. Now because of the fact that there were tons of sightings of this huge, hat-shaped UFO, as well as some of the eyewitnesses even swear that they saw Antonio coming out of this craft, made this 1977 UFO abduction extremely famous in Brazil. On October 11th, 1973, a man named Charles Hickson and Calvin Parker were fishing off one of their local piers. While they were fishing, they started to notice a very odd bluish object in the sky. This object was very strange, and they started to wonder what this could possibly be. Then when it started to get closer, the men knew that this was not man-made. At this point, the object was not too far away from the men, and it stopped just right above the water. Then, 3 very strange beings came out of the craft. These beings were just hovering over the water, and they started to approach the fishermen. The fishermen were scared out of their minds. These beings were grayish in color, about 5 feet tall, and had very odd-shaped heads. They also had very odd things coming out of their faces. Now, it was very hard for these fishermen to comprehend what they were seeing. They thought that these creatures might not be creatures at all, but robots. When these things got close enough, they actually tried to communicate with the fishermen, and Calvin passed out right on the spot, and Charles just stood there frozen in fear. Then these beings, or robots, took these men to their craft. Now, once inside the UFO, Charles and Calvin were taken to different rooms, and Charles would never forget what happened to him. He was being scanned and operated on by a huge eye. In his own words, "There ain't no way to describe it. It looked like an eye, like a big eye. It had some kind of attachment to it. It moved in front of my face. I saw dials and gadgets moving all around. It went behind me, then came back over me. It went all over my body, up and down. Then it disappeared back into the wall. I was scared to death. I thought I was going to die." Now, after these fishermen were examined, they were returned back to the pier. And Charles and Calvin couldn't believe that they were still alive. And not too long after this encounter, they told the world what happened to them. And of course, most people laughed at their story. On February 23rd, 1975, 2 boys in Japan noticed a pair of orange UFOs in the sky. The boys were amazed and couldn't stop looking at these UFOs. Then the 2 objects started to release a bunch of smaller UFOs, and these smaller UFOs started to descend to the ground. One of these UFOs landed really close to where the boys were playing. So the boys ran to go see if they could find it, and it didn't take them very long. The boys spotted one of these smaller UFOs in a vineyard within their estate. The boys were staring in awe, wondering what this object could possibly be. Then a hatch opened up, and some very odd creatures started to come out of it. These creatures were 4 foot tall, had silver uniforms, large pointy ears, brownish wrinkly skin, and 3 very large metallic-looking fangs. Right away, these aliens saw the curious boys staring right at them in total amazement. One of these creatures walked right up to them and patted them on the shoulder, and it tried to communicate with the boys. The boys, scared to death, ran home as fast as they could, and they told their families what they saw. Now, one of the mothers believed that something must have happened to her son, and a lot of people in the neighborhood were wondering what the heck was going on, as the boys were very loud and very hysterical. The boys told everybody to follow them, and when they got to the location, they all saw this orange object take off at amazing speeds. The light coming from this craft was so bright that the onlookers had to close their eyes. Now, the boys were the only ones to see these alien beings, but since so many saw the UFO, an official investigation was launched. The investigators did find a ring pattern on the ground where the UFO landed, and they also found traces of radiation, making this a very interesting UFO sighting, an alien encounter. On August 17, 1971, Peter Rodriguez and John Hodges were driving back home, and they saw 2 huge brains on the road. These brains were surrounded by a very odd bluish mist. So John decided to get out and investigate. Now, right after John got out of his car, he started to hear a very clear voice in his head. Then he realized that these brains were talking to him. They told John, "Take the time to understand yourselves. The time draws near when you shall need to. You shall not remember this incident until we meet again." Now, John, scared out of his mind, ran back into his car, and he floored it out of there. Later that night, when John returned home, he encountered these 2 huge brains again, and he passed out. When John came to, he realized that he was in some sort of control room. Then he came face to face with beings a lot more terrifying than the huge brains that he had just encountered. He was greeted by a group of 7 foot tall, gray-skinned humanoids. These humanoids had 6 webbed fingers and toes. After a short introduction, these alien greys started to show John holographic images of a nuclear war. John believed that these aliens were showing him an actual event that happened on another planet. And these alien beings warned him that if our species doesn't change, this will most likely happen to us. Then John started to feel very dizzy, and again he passed out. John woke up a little bit later back in his car, and from that day forward, he let the world know about the message he received. Now, one thing I would like to add is I come across a lot of these kind of stories where these highly intelligent beings abduct people and warn them about our future. So why don't they just abduct the world's most powerful people? That way we might just have a chance at saving our world and ourselves. Until next time, this is Paranormal Junkie. Make sure to hit that subscribe button and stay tuned.